Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this video will be related to, well, actually several series. So most recently I've been looking at um, ancient metalwork and, for instance, the connection between arsenic and copper, and exploring that ancient copper was actually arsenical copper or arsenical bronze and not the copper that's most often described. But this would also relate to, previous to that I was looking at ancient medicine, ancient symbology, the Voynich manuscript, herbs such as mandrake, and so I'm not exactly sure what playlist to add this to. It really does connect to this most recent series, especially connected to, to hermeticism and the transmission of ancient knowledge and science through symbols into the modern age, relating to alchemy, the alchemy of medicine, the alchemy of metalwork, and also how that would relate to geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. But this video will be a two-parter, and I'll be looking at distillation and the secrets of the alchemists, and how this, from the more modern, like medieval, up until the Renaissance period, and those famous alchemists such as Michelspacher, Meyer, Fludd, and others, but also how it relates back in time. So distillation. Now, the most common association with distillation would be something like this. Now, whether it's a legal distillery or the more clandestine type related to moonshine, but this instrument is essentially, it's an alembic. It's for distilling, and most often the association would be with alcohol. So whether it's brandy, rum, vodka, whiskey, this would be the association with distillery. So this would be this is a historic distillery, but can connect distilling spirits, alcohol, as we, rum, brandy, whiskey, vodka, etc. However, this also relates to tinctures. And so, for instance, who was it? Paracelsus, or I think Roger Bacon, he first, again, very famous previous alchemist, and with interest in medicines as well. So laudanum. Laudanum is opium mixed with alcohol. It's a tincture. Now, more often, medicinal cannabis oil, for instance, would be soaked in alcohol spirits to create a tincture. This is the most common tincture. You could also make a tincture from wine or from beer, alcohols which are fermented, not distilled, but more common, the medicinal alcohol, medical alcohol, for antiseptic reasons and cleaning, that type of alcohol, that comes from spirits, and that relies on distillation. Distilled water would be another one. Distilling is also essential in perfumes and medicines, so to extract essential oils from herbs, rose water, and these other type of, whether they're used for the perfume or for the medicinal industry, this would also be reliant a lot on distillery. However, oil refineries are essentially giant distilleries as well. They use distillation to process and refine the crude oil into the various kerosene, petroleum, etc. But this all relates to the ancient craft science of alchemy, which has because of Hollywood and a few other groups, has a association more, let's just call it the witchcraft. But the alchemist art, has the famous alchemists themselves clearly show in their illustrations and books were based on scientific application relating mostly to chemistry, whether it's metallurgy, making chemical substances that would be essential in dyes and pigments, stained glass, glazing, ceramics, metallurgy, I think I mentioned already. These are all aspects related to the chemistry of alchemy, like alchemistry. A very famous legendary alchemist was Zoroaster. This is him as depicted in the 16th century book, which credits itself to an earlier period, but Zoroaster, also famous connections, but Zoroastrianism, but he's also featured in the School of Athens painting. But he's connected to Pelican flask distillation. So this would be the instrument, and also that pelican symbol, which is a very important esoteric symbol, but that's connected to Zoroaster around about the 8th century BC. Cleopatra of Egypt is a famed alchemist. Both the Arab alchemists and the European medieval early Renaissance people spoke about Cleopatra. The alchemist is one of the illustrations connected to her, but she's also one of these, a bit like Zoroaster, whether it's pure legend, a mix of legend and truth, but either way very well famed and respected by the earlier alchemists such as Geber and Fludd, etc. She's often credited with inventing the alembic, so the distillation for spirits of alcohol, but that's just one aspect of distillation. Maria the Jewess, she's also a very famous alchemist, and she's credited with inventing something called the Maria's bath, which is a variation on the alembic, but so here we see older pictures of an alchemist's lab, and this would be a Maria's bath. So we see the boiling water and then distillation happening in that process, a more refined form of distillation. And there we can see, so just if I go back, so there we see the more typical distillation, including Maria's baths, but we also see these instruments here. These are called retorts. This is again, it's a more simple form of the alembic, but you boil the substance, the vapor rises up, and it cools on this tilted flask. So it's pointed down. The vapor would condense back into a liquid and then drip, drip, drip. Now even the word distillation, its Latin origin is to drip down. So this will be a retort. Now it's an important feature, but Zoroaster, Cleopatra the Alchemist, Maria the Jewess, they're all famous for distillation, but they're also famous for, said legendary, that they uncovered the secret of a philosopher's stone. Hermes Trismegistus was also said to have been an alchemist who uncovered the secret of a philosopher's stone. Another very important alchemist of old was Zosimos of Panopolis. That's in Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt. He's an alchemist of the Greek-Egyptian period, around about 300 AD, and we see the images connected to him where we see these distillation objects, instruments. He's also a very important feature because from him, so Zosimos roasted this realga, which is also known as ruby of arsenic or ruby sulfur. He would obtain a cloud of arsenic, which is arsenic trioxide, and then that could be reduced to grey arsenic. So it is the distillation process to obtain not just alcohol, but also to purify and separate very important elements such as arsenic, sulfur, and others. I'll link this PDF and some other sources, of course, as always, in the description, but they talk about philosopher chemist in Alexandria practiced distillation at least from 2nd century BC, as is reported by the works of Zosimos, and that they had multiple types of distillation to achieve multiple varying goals, but their goal was not to distill spirits, but to obtain substances such as sulfur, mercury, and arsenic in order to alter the composition of base metals and colour than gold. This is the common connection between philosopher's stone, turning base metals to gold, but it's the alchemist's art and based on the actual surviving ancient text is much more interesting and complicated than that. And arsenic's very important, so I'll link this particular video in the description where I was recently looking at the connection. Well, for instance, ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, even other cultures in the ancient past were not making copper and making soft copper tools, whether by accident because of the impurities in the ore, or more certainly in some cases they were making what's called arsenical bronze. Now, arsenical copper is essentially less than 1% arsenic. If you have more than 1% arsenic in your copper, that's defined as arsenical bronze. That's an archaeological term because more than 1% means with certainty that arsenic has been added. This makes the tool much stronger. This can be found in all across the ancient world. Again, ancient world were not using pure copper. That's a very modern thing, whether by some cases by accident, but certainly in many cases in the very, very ancient past, they were making arsenical bronze, which is much harder. It's essentially copper with more than 1% arsenic. I'll if you're new to the channel or haven't seen, I did a video going into that in details in regards to Mohs hardness scale, etc., and a lot of this not correct descriptions of ancient copper tools and their aspects in there. Just a moment. So this is very important in regards to the chemistry / alchemy of old, and how substances such as sulfur, mercury and arsenic were very important, not just in metallurgy, essential in that craft, but they're also used in medicines. For instance, sulfur, still very important. Even arsenic is used in agriculture still to this day, and mercury, of course, as well. So there's multiple aspects to these substances essential in the ancient craft. In these previous series, which I was looking at the ancient gods of metallurgy, or for instance Ptah and the connection to dwarfs, and the arsenic connection in regards to metallurgy as well. But Ptah, green skin, how this would connect to arsenical connections. But he's also the god of craftsmen and of architects. His high priest was the chief controller of the craftsmen. We will be getting more into this, but this does relate to these previous videos and this connection with arsenic. So more than just making alcohol or obtaining oils for medicine and perfume, distillation was essential in refining other substances and elements which would apply to all sorts of the alchemy of making colors, pigments for dyes, for paints, metalwork, stained glass windows, also acids for washing and polishing, and all whatever is chemistry is alchemy. And people in the past were making clothes, metal, glass, colors and pigments, medicines. So this has been happening for quite some time, and is not like hidden history. It's pretty much well known, just not reported very often. So in regards to a classical image of an alchemist, we also see these instruments here where she is engaged in distillation. This is a catalogue, a brochure basically of glass implements used in the alchemist trade, including the retort, which is again essential in modern chemistry and also ancient chemistry. This is Robert Fludd's image, which is very esoteric, multiple symbols, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music happening in there. But if we focus in on the very center, distillation, you can even see the distillation apparatus in there as well. Another one where we see Artemis and the furnace, but also distillation, the retort, and the more common alembic as well. So that's another feature. These are Stephan Michelspacher, again a very famous, very important alchemist. And for instance, the metallurgy trade, you can see mining, but of course the caduceus. All these, it's a very rich, it's a textbook in many ways, these imagery in the writings as well. But if we focus on this portion, here we can see on the left hand side all the instruments of distillation, also crucibles and furnaces related to metalwork, the broader range of the alchemical practice. This image in regard to Kabbalah and well, let's not go into that, but what we have, if I focus in on this central, and again this is repeated across all the famous alchemists, whether it was Valentine, Michelspacher, Meyer, of course Fludd and others, but what we see is this triangle with this symbol, which is sulfur, this symbol is mercury, and this symbol is salt. Salt, sulfur and mercury is like an early version of the periodic table of elements in regards to how sulfur, so sulfur, like in a match head, once you burn it, it's gone. Mercury, you can boil it and then recapture it, as where salt doesn't burn. Well, it does if you've got a nuclear reactor happening, but it's sort of what sulfur vanishes, goes. Mercury, you can recapture it and use it again. You can use it to purify gold and silver, for instance, boil off the mercury, and then you're left with pure gold or silver. And the mercury you can recapture, essentially with the process of distillation. The vapors can be turned back into a liquid. Very important feature in regards to alchemy. In the description, I'll also drop a link to a playlist, Science of the Symbols, where I go through Fludd, Michelspacher, Kircher, and these other people, and how it's geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, music, and alchemical symbolism is in there. If you're new to the channel, it's quite a long playlist, but there's I'll go through those piece by piece. But the importance of, again, distillation, how they would reply to sulfur, mercury, and salt as a process to obtain and purify and create different examples. So I'll attach the link to this and a few other papers and links in regards to distillation, but again, as they're describing sulfur, mercury, and arsenic. Again, arsenic are so important in metallurgy, the ancient copper being arsenical/arsenical bronze, not modern pure copper. But now we have this image of Stephan Michelspacher, which is very important because we see these steps. Now these are the 7 operations or steps in regards to the alchemical art. We also see the 7 metals, so mercury, Sun or Apollo, gold, iron, Mars or Aries, Venus, copper, and also silver of the moon, the Jupiter, is that lead or tin, but Saturn and Jupiter being lead and tin. Also they have these connected to the zodiac. You see these symbols around here. Well, they also relate to so sulfur, salt, and mercury, but also various salts, vitriols, etc., that are used in the process. But these 7 steps, so calcination, sublimation, solution, putrefaction, distillation, coagulation, and tincture. These are very important alchemical processes still used in the chemistry today. So putrefaction is another term for fermentation. You ferment wine or beer. Calcination is essentially to burn something down to ash and then to extract these features from it. Solution is a solvent, but coagulation would be the process used, for instance, in cheese making. Now, coagulation of blood will be the most common term, but you coagulate when you make cheese. But also tincture. Now, a tincture is for instance, laudanum, which was opium in alcohol, or now medicinal cannabis tincture. So just some substance or herb that's been soaked in alcohol to extract that. And so tincture would also relate very closely to distillation. You can make a tincture from other alcohols such as beer or wine, which come from putrefaction or fermentation, but most common tinctures and more modern ones are based on spirit alcohols, and that's from distillation. So in regards to the history of distillation, this will not be a total, of course, just to show. So definitely in the medieval period, where those famed alchemists, they were using distillation to make cognac and brandy, but also alcohol to make other medicinal or chemical solutions and as such. Arab alchemists such as Geber around about the 8th century, they were clearly quite skilled in distillation. 3rd century AD, Zosimos of Panopolis in Upper Egypt, he wrote on distillation. I mentioned as also he was able to use realga to use and separate arsenic, very important feature into metallurgy and these other aspects as well. Dioscorides, who wrote De Materia Medica, which is a very famous herbal book, which was used way at least even up until the 1900s, around about that period, but up until the 1500s it was the preeminent book on medicinal herbs and substances, which include sulfur, etc. He wrote on and described the process of distillation in Punjab in India, that part of India, Pakistan region. They were also using distillation for various applications, much more than just distilling alcohol. I'm not including China in this because China were doing it quite early as well. 4th century BC, the alchemists, including the Arabs, refer to Cleopatra the Alchemist, practicing around about that time. She invented the alembic according to most traditions. However, in the 12th century BC, there are Akkadian tablets which describe something which is almost certainly a form of distillation, and there's also some evidence in regards to certain pots and jars that this was being practiced as well, 12th century BC. That's out of order, but 5th century BC, so prior to Panopolis, there's also evidence in ancient India, Indus Valley region, that they were using terracotta pots to perform a sort of distillation. However, Paolo Ravesti, and I couldn't find any good imagery, but in 1975 he was part of a team who published a report and found evidence not just of the pots but also of the chemistry which would relate to distillation in the ancient Indus civilization, most famously connected to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. So 3000 BC, this could have been happening, but certainly now, for instance, in ancient Egypt, even back to the Old Kingdom, they had all of the materials and the elements that would have required, that would have been needed to perform distillation. However, the evidence of that, well, I want to get to that in the next part, but so this history of certain distillation, but also possible distillation up to 3000 BC. So now we go to Egypt. Now Panopolis, which is now called Akhmin, this was where Zosimos in the 3rd century was writing on, well, arsenic, but also on distillation. But several centuries, again, is Cleopatra entirely real? But and where was she practicing? Most likely Alexandria, Library of Alexandria, around that would have been that period. And well, she's credited with the alembic, and that would have put her in the 300 BCs or 4th century BC. That this was happening, distillation, again, more than alcohol. It's an essential process in chemistry. And that brings us to Saqqara, so the famed step pyramid, pyramid of Djoser, and also the pyramid of Unas, which includes the first pyramid texts which refer to natron and the faience glass as well being referred to in those pyramid texts. I did a series in regards to them and how they've been reinterpreted through a more scientific lens, that these pyramid texts are not just purely philosophical, religious instructions, that there is actually a astronomical, chemistry, seasonal basis in there, that they're much more nuanced than what would be generally referred to. But that's an important feature because I believe there's evidence of distillation happening in Egypt at 2400 BC, and we'll be using the retort being this important instrument in distillation. And this would also connect to Ptah, who's the god of craftsmen and the god of architects, so he's builders, science, chemistry, which would include metals and colours, and well, just the whole range of what chemistry involves. And this would also relate to the famed goddess Seshat. I did a series on her and on Heliopolis, but her primary sanctuary was at Heliopolis. She was a god of architecture, geometry, mathematics. She invented writing. Thoth taught it to humanity, but she invented it. She was also the mistress of the House of Books, or the Houses of Life, which were these schools attached to major temple sites. And of course, goddess of surveying and architecture, so she's also essential to the craft of building, but also the ancient sciences. So Ptah and Seshat. Now Ptah was also the husband to Sekhmet, who was a goddess of war and battle, but she was also the goddess of medicines, and this will be related in upcoming episodes when I want to look at the ancient Egyptian and Babylonian medicines and how that influenced the Greeks, Romans, and then up until the modern day. But I believe that there is some very great evidence of distillation, but it also relates to Ptah, to that arsenical copper and bronze of ancient Egypt, the mining, the alchemy of those, but also how it would relate to the seven liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic, via what's verifiable, not going into curious areas. So that will be in part 2. That's to be continued. So SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. Hope you enjoyed, and as always, there's always more to come.